All right, thank you for coming out this evening for our keynote address as part of our H2OLA, or Water in Louisiana, symposium. My name is Michael Martin. I'm director of the Center for Louisiana Studies here at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and I will be introducing tonight's featured speaker. Before that, I'd like to make a couple of reminders. First off, if you have a cell phone, please silence that. Secondly, as you came in, there was not a registration table, but a table out front with a lot of information on it, including a sign-up sheet. If you didn't sign up, you're welcome to do that for our newsletter, our Center for Louisiana Studies newsletter. We do these sort of things quite often. Another thing that was out there was an evaluation form. One of our sponsors asked that we have people fill these out to give them feedback on where their money's going and what kind of job we did and so forth. So please pick one of these up and fill it out if you have time on the way out. As part of that, I'd like to go ahead and thank our sponsors once again. If you weren't here this morning or this afternoon, you missed a very diverse and very important set of discussions regarding water and its relationship with Louisiana and Louisianians. And we couldn't have put this on, including tonight's address, without the help of some other groups. First and foremost, UL Lafayette's College of Liberal Arts, the Jamie and Thelma Gilbo Charitable Trust, the Haney Family Foundation, and the Atchafalaya National Heritage Area. It's the National Heritage Area that asked for these evaluations. We'd also like to thank AOC Community Media, who is here filming. They'll be putting up the entirety of the symposium once they get it edited down on their TV channels and their YouTube channels. So if you missed a portion of today's proceedings, you can catch up by keeping an eye out on AOC. And we'd like to thank Louisiana Immersive Technologies Enterprise that has provided us this wonderful room to use all day long. It's truly one of the best places on our campus, and we're very grateful to them for allowing us to use it. Finally, I want to personally thank, and I thanked them this morning, but I think it needs to be reiterated, Jennifer Guidry, my assistant director for research, for programming and special projects, who worked together with Dr. Liz Skilton of the UL History Department in getting this program together, really from the ground up. What started as an idea, they turned into a reality, and so they deserve not only thanks, but I would say a round of applause. There's Liz. I don't know where Jennifer is, but if you know Jennifer, make sure to tell her thanks. And now on to our keynote speaker. John Barry is a prize-winning and New York Times best-selling author whose books have won multiple major awards. The National Academies of Science named his 2004 book, The Great Influenza, the story of the deadliest pandemic in history, that year's outstanding book on science and medicine. His earlier book, Rising Tide, The Great Mississippi Flood of 1927 and How It Changed America, won the Francis Parkman Prize of the Society of American Historians for the year's best book on American history. And in 2005, that same book was named by the New York Public Library as one of the 50 best books in the preceding 50 years. His latest book is Roger Williams and the Creation of the American Soul, Church, State, and the Birth of Liberty, which was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize and a winner of the New England Society Book Award. His articles have appeared in such scientific journals as Nature and the Journal of Infectious Disease, as well as in lay publications ranging from Sports Illustrated to Politico, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Fortune, Time, Newsweek, and Esquire. A frequent guest on every broadcast network in the United States, he has appeared on such shows as NBC's Meet the Press, ABC's World News, and NPR's All Things Considered, and he's appeared on such foreign media as the BBC and Al Jazeera. His work has involved him in two areas of public policy. In 2004, the National Academies of Science asked him to give the keynote speech at its first international scientific meeting on pandemic influenza. And in addition to serving on the federal government's Infectious Disease Board of Experts, he was a member of the original team that developed plans for mitigating a pandemic by using non-pharmaceutical interventions, that is, public health measures to take before a vaccine becomes available. Both the Bush and the Obama administrations sought his advice on influenza, preparedness and response, and he continues his activity in this area. He has been equally active in water issues. After Hurricane Katrina, the Louisiana congressional delegation asked him to chair a bipartisan working group on flood protection, and from its founding in 2007 until October 2013, he served on the Southeast Louisiana Flood Protection Authority East, which oversees levee districts in metropolitan New Orleans, and on the Louisiana Coastal Protection and Restoration Authority, which is responsible for the state's hurricane protection. He left those boards because of his role in a lawsuit against ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Chevron, and 93 other oil, gas, and pipeline companies for the damage they have done to the flood protection system in the board's jurisdiction. Barry has worked with state, federal, United Nations, and World Health Organization officials on influenza, water-related diseases and disasters, and risk communication. Tonight, we are honored to have him here to discuss the tip of the spear, Louisiana, the river, and the sea. John Barry.
Thank you. Thank you. First, Mike, thanks very much for inviting me. I've been to Lafayette several times in the past. This is my favorite trip. Second, I don't like to give canned speeches. This speech is an experiment. I finished it at 5:21 this afternoon. So I don't know how it's going to go. One person already walked out. Hadn't even started yet. He had to go to a Boy Scout meeting. I even know him. Obviously, this state is intimately involved in water. And when I think of the Mississippi River, which largely defines Louisiana, this is what I think of. I honestly don't think of a straight line that runs from Minnesota south. You could just as easily say it begins near Buffalo, New York, as in Minnesota, or in Canada, Saskatchewan, Alberta, in the Rocky Mountains. I even managed to deduct from my taxes as a business expense a trip to Taos, New Mexico, because that's about 30 miles from one tributary of the Mississippi River. All of that obviously comes down here. All of it affects this state. And this map actually has a historical significance as well. This was put together after the 1927 flood, presented to Congress to demonstrate that it was a national problem. And well, I'll talk about that later. Okay, so next slide. What I do want to talk about is all the factors that have gone into the problems that Louisiana is facing on the coast. The title was The Point of the Spear. What is happening in Louisiana, as probably everybody in the audience knows, is going to happen everywhere in the world. We are first, or just about, or we really are first. In some areas, we're tied for first, but most of them, we are first. And there are multiple factors that have gone into the problem. This is about the Eads jetties. If you go back, you know, right now there are off the tip of the boot, there are jetties that extend 2.5 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico. James Eads was one of the most brilliant engineers in history. In the 1930s, deans of American colleges of engineering named him one of the 5 greatest engineers of all time, with Da Vinci and Thomas Edison and so forth. And he's easily, I think, the greatest engineer ever to work on the Mississippi River. The river builds land, as I think everybody here knows. It carries a tremendous amount of sediment. Historically, before humans interfered, it was number 7 in terms of the sediment load of all the rivers in the world, and all the major rivers anyway. And that sediment drops out when the river hits the ocean and builds land. But that also means it built sandbars. And the sandbars were a tremendous commercial problem facing the entire Mississippi Valley. If you remember that first slide, you know, Pittsburgh is a port with direct access to the ocean because of the river. Tulsa, Oklahoma is a port today because of the Mississippi River. But all this was being stopped up as ships were getting bigger and bigger, and it was a huge problem. Eads solved it by building those jetties, which, just like narrowing the nozzle of a garden hose, he narrowed the current of the river, the channel of the river, pointed it at the sandbars, and they blew right through the river, blew right through the sandbars, and opened up the commercial possibilities. It had tremendous impact. For example, from St. Louis out the mouth of the Mississippi River in 1875, the year he started work on the jetties, there were 6,500 tons of shipping that went from St. Louis out the mouth of the river. In 1880, the year after he finished, there were 456,000 tons. So you go from 6,500 tons to over 450,000 tons in 5 years. That's the impact of the jetties, and I'm going to skip over talking about the technology that it used, but it had an enormous impact. But it also meant, of course, that all the sediment that used to be available to build the coast was now being dropped in deep water off the continental shelf. And that was the first blow to Louisiana. This is the second blow. This is Cabin Tully crevasse in 1927, just after it started. That ended up being more than half a mile wide. The average flow over Niagara Falls is about 70,000 cubic feet of water a second. This crevasse carried more like 300,000, possibly more than that. So more than 4 times the average flow of Niagara Falls was coming out of the river in that crevasse. It wasn't the only crevasse. And it flooded. You could go from Vicksburg to Monroe by boat. And there were also flood on the other side of the river. So at its widest point in 1927, the river was actually close to 100 miles wide. This is actually the cover shot from the hardcover edition of my book. I don't know why they changed it on the paperback. I wish they hadn't, but writers don't have any control over the cover. And if I'm not mistaken, I know that's in Louisiana. I think it's Murrayville. Again, obviously 1927. That's Melville. Oh, let's skip. So the 1927 flood was the second blow and probably one of the single biggest blows to the Louisiana coast in terms of in terms of interfering with natural flows of sediment and things like that. There had been levees on the Mississippi River almost from the day New Orleans was founded. There was an almost complete system on the lower river by the Civil War. But these were not great levees. There were floods in a big one in 1882, probably close to as big as 1927. There were floods after that. There was 1897, 1903, 1907, 1912, 1913, 1916, 1917, 1922. Every one of those floods, somewhere along the line, there were leakages, there were crevasses. there was a levee system, but it was not sealed. So there was still sediment, and I skipped over this, almost going back to that first slide. Again, I'm assuming certain knowledge in this room, but I should say it anyway rather than assume it. I think you all know that all of coastal Louisiana was created by the deposit of sediment of the Mississippi River. All the land from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, was made by the deposit, to the Gulf of Mexico, was made by the deposit of sediment. There's about 4,000 square miles or so, maybe a little more than that, that was made directly from various mouths of the river as it moved east and west. Another several thousand square miles made as coastal currents carried the sediment from the mouth of the river to the west toward Lake Charles. In total, about 8,000 square miles of the coast was made by the river. So 1927 comes along, and finally the federal government decides, under tremendous political pressure, because they were largely responsible, at least partly responsible for the disaster, the federal government decided they were going to build a high-quality levee system. And since that levee system was completed, there has not been a crevasse on a main levee of the Mississippi River. So all these leakages that used to occur stopped occurring. And the sustaining sediment from overflows stopped feeding and helping to sustain coastal Louisiana. So that was certainly a big blow. And I'm doing this in chronological order. The next was the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway. Now, the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway was first thought of in the 1870s. It was largely complete, at least to Houston, by 1935, and maybe a little bit further west. And the GIWW started allowing quite a bit of saltwater intrusion. And it was the first of the main navigation channels that started killing all, saltwater intrusion kills the plants. The Louisiana coast is not like New England, where you have rocks. It's mud held together by roots. You kill the plants, the roots die, there's nothing to hold the mud together, it basically melts into the ocean. So this was an important factor in saltwater intrusion. Interestingly, this was a creature of the oil industry. One of the single players most responsible for building the GIWW, or getting it accepted by Congress, was a guy named Joseph Cullinan, who was a founder of Texaco and Magnolia Petroleum. And he also built the first refineries and pipelines in Texas. He was really a pretty sharp guy, a logistical mastermind. And the GIWW has always been 90% to 99% oil dependent. For example, in 1935, the first year of its full operation, there was one reach that carried 2,056,000 tons of shipping. 2,010,000 tons of that was oil. And that remains largely true today, although when it was conceived, it was sold, not only for oil, but sugar, rice, and other commodities. This is the Houma Navigation Canal. This is what saltwater intrusion has done to some of the areas around there. The GIWW would have similar impacts. So would the Calcasieu Ship Channel and throughout the state. You get salt water, you have a problem. The next chronological factor, if we go way back to the first slide, we go way up the Missouri River. Where's the Missouri? Way up there. In fact, even further. Let me see. Way over here, there were people on the Missouri River who decided they wanted to have navigation and flood protection up there. This is the Fort Peck Dam, which is more than 2,000 miles upriver on the Missouri. So you add another 1,000+ miles from the Gulf of Mexico. This was actually the first issue of Life magazine had an iconic photograph by Margaret Bourke White of this dam while it was being constructed. At the time, it was the largest dam in the world. The Missouri, I said at the beginning that the Mississippi historically was number 7 of major rivers in the world in terms of carrying sediment. The Missouri was number 2. Most of the sediment in the Mississippi River came out of the Missouri River. Historically, there are about 400 million tons of sediment that the Mississippi River dumped into the Gulf of Mexico every year. Almost 200 million tons of that came out of the Missouri. Everything else provided the other 200 million tons. And the idea was you would build these enormous reservoirs, and in low water, you would release the water so that you could get a certain minimum height, depth of water, so you could have barge traffic up there. Okay, and this is a construction of another dam, the Garrison Dam. And this is what happened. Before the dams were constructed, there are, according to the Corps of Engineers, there are 40,000 dams on the entire Mississippi River system. There are 6 dams out of 40,000 on the upper Missouri River, which retain 100 million tons of sediment a year that used to come down here. The last one was completed in the early 60s, according to the U.S. Geological Survey. After that dam was completed, quote, the flow of sediment virtually stopped, unquote. So that's the, that construction started in the 30s and was, the different dams, different times, and more impact, finally completed in the 60s. So I said I'm trying to do this in more or less chronological order. But you can see the impact on the sediment that was no longer available down here. Now this is 2010. We had, it wasn't an enormous flood in 2010, but there was high water. It was pretty decent high water. This is during the BP spill. The black area, that's oil. How do I get this? There we go. Whoops. Okay. So this is the oil. This is just natural sediment. This is a standard sediment flow on the Bird's Foot Delta from a high water. And gives you an idea of how much more. You basically would have doubled that sediment flow in its natural state. And plus, it would have been coming out all the way quite a bit further upriver if you didn't have levees. But you still got pretty good sediment flow. Still pretty impressive. And this is not even a great flood. It was useful that year in fending off some of the damage from BP. And they opened up all the diversions. They had a few diversions that weren't they weren't designed to build land. They opened up full throttle trying to push that oil back, keep it off the beach. Okay. So what we've done so far, I've tried to demonstrate. You've got the jetties, the levees, the dams, the navigation channels, all that humans have built that help make Louisiana, with the exception of the ones on the Missouri River, which don't affect us other than negatively. But it wasn't all, I mean, the people living on the coast created a few problems themselves. A lot of you may know Carl Brasso from the Center of Louisiana Studies. Is he retired now? Yeah, I don't think I ever met him. And I actually just heard of this book very recently. I tried to get it today. The library didn't have it, and the bookstore here didn't have it. But one of these things this book does is talk about how the people who lived in the area didn't treat the coast so well either. For example, the way they farmed rice ended up creating a lot of saltwater intrusion. That's not the, I'm not an expert on this book. I haven't had an opportunity to read it yet, but I certainly intend to get it. It came out earlier this year. I'm sorry I hadn't heard of it longer ago, so that I could have read it. So we have, farm agriculture as well as the other issues. And then we get to, and I'm leaving out things like nutria, which also create problems. Then we get to the one that I'm probably best known for. There are 37 studies, scientific studies, including by a consortium of pipeline companies, including the American Petroleum Institute, including the Louisiana Mid-Continent Association, Oil and Gas Association. Every one of those 37 studies says the oil and gas industry is a significant contributor to land loss. That pipeline study said for every mile of pipeline destroyed 54 acres. The American Petroleum Institute said, well, I got a slide on that, so I won't tell you what it's like. Mid-Continent Oil and Gas, Chris John, who runs that, gets mad every time I say it, but it was a study of several specific sites. It wasn't a comprehensive study, but it said the overwhelming cause of land loss in the particular sites they looked at was oil and gas canals. That's what it says, but he gets mad whenever I quote it. See, probably if he had been the head of the association when they did the study, maybe it would never have been published. I don't know. I shouldn't have said that. I tell you, let me retract that. That's not fair, particularly since he's not here. Okay. So I apologize in advance to Chris. Okay, this is sort of a classic. This included, this was not an industry study, but it was partly funded by industry. Industry scientists signed off on it. It attributed 36%. This is the API study, 34%. This is the Mid-Continent study I just quoted. I forgot I had the slide or I wouldn't have quoted it. Now, this is a study in 2006 by the State Department of Natural Resources, which has often been attacked as a wholly owned subsidiary of the oil and gas industry. Nonetheless, the Department of Natural Resources, looking at the two parishes that have had the greatest land loss in the state, concluded that in those two parishes, 76% of the land loss was caused by oil and gas. In that study, they went and looked at different points in the study. And in this particular area, they attributed over 90% of the land loss to oil and gas. In fact, it's more like 99% in this particular area. There are some areas of the state where there's land loss and oil and gas has almost no role, or maybe no role. There are other areas where it's practically all oil and gas, like this one. Self-explanatory. That's a shot of, obviously, canals that have degraded. People in this room probably know the technology a lot better than I. They didn't have horizontal drilling. If you wanted to drill a well a couple hundred yards away, you had to dredge a canal and drill another well. Fortunately, technology has improved dramatically. You don't have to do anything like that anymore. However, even back in the day, there were technologies that they chose not to use, that the industry chose not to use, that would have been a lot less harmful. So, you know, I earlier was talking about what a blow the levees were, and they are a blow. But, you know, the people who have taken issue with what I say about the oil and gas industry have said it's the levees, it's the levees, it's the levees. It's only the levees. It's not only the levees. The floodplain in the Mississippi River does not extend all the way across the state. There was not a single levee anywhere on the Mississippi River. The floodplain stops around Vermilion Bay. So if it were only the levees, there would be no land loss in the western part of the state. This is Cameron Parish. And you see the quote underneath it from Robert B. B, it doesn't say that, identify him in there. He not only was Shell's chief offshore engineer, he's now a professor, I think he's probably retired emeritus now, at Berkeley. And he also headed the National Science Foundation study into what went wrong in Katrina. And that comment, which is quoted in there, came from that study. Or that comment, his knowledge came from that study. I think that's from a deposition which he did for the state of Louisiana. And if you say, well, it's all hurricane damage, the areas next to this, is not in the picture, are healthy, where there was no oil activity. So all these little spider webs things, those are all oil canals. And actually, the GIWW is right up here. And that's one of the things the GIWW did, was it gave access, easy access to all these areas for oil exploration. Okay, did the industry obey the law? Well, going back to 1920, there were laws and regulations that would have prohibited a lot of these activities. They became increasingly specific until 1980, when they became absolutely explicit. So you can all read. I won't read. Nothing I like better than to sit in an audience with a slideshow up there and have the guy read to me what's on the slide. You're all grown up, so you can read it yourself. Self-explanatory. Now, most of the damage predates 1980, but not all of it. This is after 1980. The plug was supposed to be constructed within 90 days. It was never constructed by the industry. You paid $5 million to fix it. You, taxpayers. Back a few years ago, when we had a big political fight over the lawsuit in the state legislature, we went and compiled. This is a partial list. We stopped counting because the legislature had already voted. There's no point in doing further research. These were all projects that were absolutely directly related to oil and gas that you paid to fix. You paid. They didn't pay. Now, this is where we are today. This is not some future slide 200 years from now. This is today. Now, this is not, as it says, it's not any one storm. You know, every storm has a different track. Every storm is different. But in the worst case for each of the possible tracks for a Category 3 storm, that's the result. greater than 9 feet. That covers an awful lot of coastal Louisiana, except for Metro New Orleans, which has got its new levee system. And the category for 5, you know, Opelousas. I mean, Lafayette's, I'll let that sink in for a minute, or a few seconds anyway. You know, again, that's today, that's right now. So we've got a few months left in hurricane season. Now, you think this is something in the distant future, further land loss by 2030. 2030 is tomorrow. That's tomorrow. You know, Katrina was 2005. That's 12 years ago. This is 13 years from now. This isn't something your grandchildren are going to face. You're facing it. This is the last thing I added at 5:21 today, which is why you can see how elegant the type is and how well illustrated it is. So we all remember what happened last year. I'm sure some people in the room have either personally suffered or have friends or relatives who got hit pretty hard last year. You know, supposedly that event, you can never tie any individual event to global warming. Of course you can't. But scientists tell you it was 40% more likely to have an event like what we had last year because of global warming, the increasing intensity of the storms. And that's a lot of rain. It's all in the last 18 months. That's a lot of rain. Now, maybe there are 97% of the scientists who study global warming believe that humans are major factors in global warming. 3% think humans do not play much of a role. And it's quite possible those 3% are correct. However, if you were about to get on an airplane and 97% of aeronautical engineers told you, don't get on that airplane, that's going to crash, it can't stay aloft. And 3% said, those guys don't know what they're talking about, go ahead, get on it. Are you going to get on that airplane? However, almost all the elected officials in Louisiana say, oh, no global warming. Or if there's global warming, oh, humans don't have anything to do with it. They're denying science. They want to get on the airplane. They're taking you with them. Okay. This is a 2100 slide. It actually looks worse now. This is a few years ago. You know, you can see if you flew to, I flew to Baton Rouge because it was so much cheaper, even though I wasn't paying for the flight. I came down, I live in New Orleans, but I actually was in Washington, came here from Washington. So you probably have a similar experience. Flying to Lafayette was really expensive. I don't know how a lot of you probably fly out of Baton Rouge for that reason. You probably may not fly out of New Orleans. But, you know, Kenner, that's where the airport is. It's in the lake. There's no more land bridge. Right now, there is what is referred to as the Orleans Land Bridge, which extends out into the lake towards Slidell and almost completely closes off the lake. If that land bridge disappears, every storm that comes into the lake will increase the storm surge by 7 feet. That means that storms that today are not a problem anywhere could overtop every levee in the lake. Not only the metro area in New Orleans, it would flood, it would carry hurricane storm surge practically to Baton Rouge, and of course, all along the North Shore. So that's 2,100 if we don't do anything. We have a master plan. It's called a $50 billion master plan. The reality is, it's a lot more expensive than that. How are you $70 billion short on a plan that's only cost $50 billion? Because the real cost is $100 billion. And we have 20. If the master plan were, let me go back to this one again for a second. You know, for example, the current master plan doesn't include a penny for maintenance. Doesn't include all sorts of things. I mean, at the moment, we even have, the state has a problem of, two problems. You know, we're counting on getting a share of offshore revenue. Both the Obama administration and the Trump administration tried to cancel that. They say, why should Louisiana get it? Let it go to the whole country. And, you know, how long that will last, we don't know. At the moment, you know, for this year, I think it'll probably succeed in putting off that attempt to take it back. The money hadn't even started coming. It won't start flowing until really next year. When it was passed in the Bush administration, they on purpose dated it 10 years out so it wouldn't count against their own budget projections. So now we're finally about to start seeing the money, and both the Obama administration and Trump want to take the money away. So that's over $100 million a year, which we're relying on for our master plan. In addition, there's a cost share that the state owes the federal government of another $100 million a year for its share of the levee system around New Orleans, which we're trying to get the federal government to forgive. We're not making a lot of progress on that. So this number is not counting that $200 million. That's giving us credit for that $200 million. It's not counting the potential loss of the $100 million from the offshore program coming in, and it's not counting the $100 million going out to pay back the cost share. So that's a very optimistic number. The reality is the only money we have is from the BP spill. If it weren't for BP, the state wouldn't, in effect, wouldn't have a dime. It'd have like $30 million a year for a $50 billion, really $100 billion plan. How many years do you think it takes to build a $100 billion plan at $30 million a year? Okay, so if we ever actually funded the master plan, Tim Ryan, the former chancellor of the University of New Orleans and an economist, before that he was dean of a business school, did a study, and this was the conclusion. If the plan were actually funded, the Dutch make $9 billion a year exporting their expertise on water. The title of this talk, Mike only asked me for it, I think, on Friday, so it didn't get printed. And I said, I don't know, I was point of the spear, I don't know. What we face here is happening all over the world. That is an economic opportunity if you develop the expertise. The Dutch have it. Immediately after Katrina, there were more Dutch walking the streets in New Orleans than there were New Orleans residents home. So if you start funding the master plan and developing the expertise, you can start selling that around the world and the country, including New York and Sandy and so forth. Okay, this is, I said there was no crevasse since the levees built after 1928 on the mainline levees. There's actually was in the 2011 flood, which was a very, very big flood, very big. The Corps thinks it was bigger than 1927. I'm not so sure. It's hard to, there was definitely more water in the river in 1927, but they didn't have in 1927 these enormous reservoirs. You know, the coastline of the reservoirs on the upper Missouri River, which I talked about earlier, that's a longer coastline than California's coastline. Those are enormous reservoirs. So it's hard to figure exactly what the flow would have been if those and other reservoirs elsewhere on the Mississippi River system were not in existence. If you add them all in, it's possible 2011 would have been bigger than 1927. Anyway, it was a big enough flood that maybe 80 miles, 90 miles downriver from New Orleans, where they don't really have a very powerful levee system. If you remember that the slide where all the sediment was leaking out down at the Bird's Foot Delta, okay, there was an actual break in the levee right here. It's called Marty. A guy named John Lopez from the Lake Pontchartrain Basin Foundation named it Mardi Gras Pass because it happened right around Mardi Gras. And this is 2016, so last year. These, well, that's what it says. You know, again, I hate people reading to me exactly what is up there on a slide. You can see the actual activity of, okay, you can't read it, so I'll read it to you. I see a couple of people squinting. This is sediment that is pouring out Mardi Gras Pass, which is a very small, effectively it's a diversion that is part of the master plan to build. The sediment filling up oil and gas canals. I mean, obviously there's water in them, they're not full of sediment. But over a period of time, that can be filled in. And that's the possibility you get with diversions. Now, as bad as the situation looks for Louisiana, and it's quite possible, depending on how bad sea level rise is, that we could do everything right and still go underwater, and you could still have beachfront property in Lafayette or Opelousas. But we have a chance. And the reason we have a chance is because of the Mississippi River. If you are built on a rock and sea level rises, you are underwater, period. But this is a living, dynamic system. And if you have, and sea level rise doesn't go up 10 feet in a day. If it goes up 10 feet, we're going underwater. But it doesn't may not go up there that much. It goes up very gradually. And if you provide sediment and fresh water, that land will adjust and rise with sea level. That's what gives us a fighting chance. That's what makes it worthwhile to at least try to do something. If it weren't for that, you should all just tell your kids and grandkids, move. But that makes it worthwhile fighting. And that's it. So, thank you very much. And I wanted to leave quite a bit of time for questions, which I think I have. And since I never gave that talk before, I don't know how long it took anyway. Okay, thank you. I do have something else to say that's relevant. And the reality is, you know, I said it gives us a chance. The reality is, whether we take advantage of that chance or not is up to you. It's not up to anybody else. We have elected officials who say there's no human element in global warming. They're siding with those 3% of aeronautical engineers who want you to get on that airplane. You got to let them know that you think they are nuts. The other thing is, I didn't really talk about the lawsuit that the levee board filed against the industry. The industry, without any question, their own studies say they account for at least a third of the damage. At least. There are other studies. In fact, the Shell professor at LSU, he's got tenure, or they probably take it away from him. Well, actually, now he's emeritus. And he thinks it's over 80% is oil and gas. Don't tell me the oil and gas industry shouldn't be making some serious contribution to fixing the problem. They paid, Exxon alone paid Rex Tillerson $187 million a year in severance. The entire industry, since Katrina, the whole industry has donated approximately $10 million voluntarily to fixing things. Now, that number is not from me. That number comes from the public relations firm for the industry. They were going around saying that the industry is paying $200 million a year for coastal restoration. They are counting money they're paying in taxes that they would pay anyway. They're not, that have been diverted from other purposes, like the $100 million from the offshore revenue. They pay that anyway. That's why both Obama and Trump want to take the money back. They're not paying an additional penny. So they were making those claims, and they were making another claim that they had spent $9 billion since Katrina on coastal restoration. They were counting not only every tax they had paid, but every fine. Bob Marshall, a New Orleans Times-Picayune columnist, or NOLA.com, asked him how they accounted for the billions of dollars they claimed. And when they explained they were adding in the fines, he said, that's like somebody who goes away for armed robbery and spends 20 years in jail saying he gave his life to crime prevention. And it was Bob Marshall who pinned him down and came up. They told him, yeah, okay, we give $10 million voluntarily. That was the number they came up with. The whole industry. One company could pay Rex Tillerson $187 million. So don't tell me that the industry can't make a contribution here. And I'm pretty confident that John Bel Edwards is going to file a lawsuit for the state. 6 parishes or 7 parishes have filed. You know, the fight between Jeff Landry and the governor over whether or not he's, Landry approving contract for these attorneys, that's approved, and that lawsuit will be forthcoming. But he didn't want to file a lawsuit. He invited the companies to sit down. There was no public press about this. He invited them fairly soon after he got inaugurated, asked them to sit down to try to work a deal out. And, again, it wasn't a press event. He didn't advertise it in advance. The press didn't know it was happening. And it was the industry after the meeting leaked it, and they told him they weren't even going to talk about it. They wouldn't even talk about it. They wouldn't discuss it. So when you know someone did damage, when they admit they did damage, and they refuse to even discuss working something out, that's what the courts are for. So whether or not the industry is held accountable in one way or another, I don't care how, that is the only chance you have of getting the money. Do you honestly think the federal government is going to pay $70 billion, send a check down here? No. So it's up to you to put some pressure on Louisiana politicians to face reality. Now, I happen to believe that the national government does have a responsibility. They have a responsibility because, for example, those dams on the upper Missouri River don't do any good to Louisiana. They help the people on the Missouri a lot. They never developed any barge traffic. Sioux City, Iowa, which is the northernmost point of navigation, went 11 years without seeing one barge. But they do give those people hydroelectric power, and they give them flood protection. So those benefits, I mean, that's a good reason why people in the Dakotas and Montana and Omaha and further downriver should contribute. But so should the oil and gas industry. So I did want to say it really is up to Louisiana. It is up to us to make something happen. Now I'll take any questions, if there are any. Yes, sir.
So I'll start off. You make the river, and rightly so, is our biggest hope.
Our only hope.
We can save ourselves because we live on a living environment, and we have the river to provide itself. However, assuming most people in the room here are from Lafayette or Southwest Louisiana, Mississippi contributes very little here. We need a diversion from the Atchafalaya closer to us than Wax Lake out to really make a difference for Southwest Louisiana and to protect Lafayette.
Well, we need to make maximum use of all the sediment. You know, when I was on the CPRA, I mean, I was well aware that my role was to look after, try to protect the state, not New Orleans. When I was on the levee board, I mean, one of the reasons we were able to go forward and file the lawsuit, unlike practically every other board in the state, there were one or two others, although we were appointed by the governor, once we were confirmed by the Senate, he couldn't fire us. My term expired, I wasn't reappointed, but he couldn't reach into the board and fire us. Otherwise, it would have been pointless for us to file the lawsuit, because we all would have been replaced the next day. What I hoped that would have happened, what would happen, was that we were going to spark a conversation, change the conversation. Until then, everybody said it was the levees. That's the only thing you ever heard. It's the levees, it's the levees, it's the levees. Incidentally, did you know it's the levees? Well, it's not just the levees. It's the levees and other things. And, you know, we weren't pulling a fast one. We told Garrett Graves 8 months before we filed the lawsuit what we were doing. We assumed he told Jindal, but he never did. Jindal was surprised. Garrett Graves wasn't. We had continuing conversations with Garrett telling him we were going forward. He just never believed it or never told the governor or whatever. So we were actually surprised by the reaction. But my point was that we were trying to change the conversation. And we did. You know, there was a poll fairly recently, maybe 2 months ago, that said 90 of likely Louisiana voters, it said 92.6% of likely Louisiana voters, and I didn't pay for this poll, believe the oil and gas industry should make a significant contribution. That was actually higher than it was 91.8% thought the federal government should pay. So it was actually more. So we did succeed in changing the conversation. In terms of the master plan, and I can tell you on the CPRA, you do have people who represent geographical areas and fight for their areas, and the master plan does get changed based on feedback. I wasn't intimately involved in the latest iteration, so I don't know exactly what changes occurred because I wasn't on the CPRA anymore. But, you know, this is not really responding to your question, but I'm trying to. The idea being, I am well aware the whole state's involved. Lake Charles is involved, Lafayette's involved, Morgan City, obviously. You have to use all the sediment. We lost almost half the sediment of the Mississippi River. It's just not as much as there is. However, there have been studies that have concluded that there is enough if we use it properly. So there are scientific and technical issues, but there are money issues. And there are other issues. When I was on the CPRA, long before I ever thought of filing a lawsuit against the oil and gas industry, I used to go around saying, as difficult as the engineering problems are, the political problems are more difficult. And at the time, I wasn't even thinking of finance. So I was naive enough to think we would get the money somewhere. What I was actually thinking of, some of the fights that we've seen surface. You put a diversion somewhere, it hurts shrimpers and oystermen. They don't like it. They don't want diversions. But if you think that's only a skirmish, you can't protect everything. The area that's gone is gone forever. That ain't coming back. We are still going to lose land in the future no matter what we do. And when you start telling people their community is not going to be helped, that they're going underwater, that is when you're going to have real political firefights. And what regions that it's largely a technical question, but the CPRA tries to feed into that cultural and it's not just economics, not just density of population. It's not easy. So long answer. Somebody, yes, sir.
Can I get you to use the microphone?
John, thanks for your presentation. I have a question. I've thought about this a lot. And when you mentioned the 2030 map, where we're going to be in 2030, here's my question. Why are banks and insurance companies still lending and hypothecating 30-year mortgages in 2018?
Well, before 2008, why were they, why were they lending on these loans that they knew were going under? In a figurative sense, when we may be going under in a not figurative sense. That's what you're asking, really, I put it a different way. I was astounded that that the business community is not supporting making the industry contribute. It's not all their fault, but part of it is. And all I've ever asked is, they contribute a commensurate part. And the business community is blind. A casual friend who was the head of the Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, he personally did more to keep me off getting renominated on the board than anybody else. I still have some respect for him. But, I told him, your kids, your grandkids, they're not going to live here. How do they think the problem is going to be solved? But that is, exactly the question that you're asking. What happens? The federal government is not going to rebuild New Orleans a second time. If Lake Charles gets flooded, maybe, but probably not to the extent that they poured money into New Orleans. Part of it was that Bush was embarrassed, so embarrassed after the initial disastrous response that, they were pretty generous in federal funds to the state. Would that happen if Lake Charles or Morgan City or somebody else got almost wiped out? It's tough. I don't know. Because we right now have about the weakest congressional delegation that we've had in the lifetime of anybody in this room. Whether those individuals are good or not, they just don't have the seniority. They're not in the right positions. They're not Bob Livingston, Chairman of Appropriations. They're not Russell Long, Chairman of Finance. They're not Bennett Johnson on Appropriations. They're not Mary Landrieu on Appropriations. You know, very junior delegation. So, another question. Yes, sir. Could you wait for the mic?
Thank you. My primary question right now is where can we get copies of those slides that you showed?
Well, so, you know, since I just put it together at 5:21, you know, I guess I can leave it with Mike. I don't mind you distributing it. That's fine. Okay. So if you have access to that, I mean, I'm not much with social media. I've got a website, but I don't know the last time. It's a year since I posted anything. I could try to figure out how to post it on my website. I may not be able to do that.
If anybody wants copies, I'll have John give me copies, and then I'll have my cards down here. You can email me and get in touch with me that way.
Or, I mean, you can just save it to that computer from my thumb drive and you'll have it.
We'll figure it out.
Thank you for your presentation. And I appreciate it in your book, in Rising Tide. I think you did a wonderful work of going in and studying many different aspects. And one thing that I liked is you were able to highlight a lot of decisions that were made. And some were bad decisions off of bad data, and some were bad decisions despite good data being available. So say we are able to have a lot of people contribute in some way to many solutions that are needed, because there's many different factors that have come here. Can you identify possible lessons learned from all of your research? Do not repeat this again when making decisions. So it may not be the identifying, do this or do that, but identify how not to make a bad decision again.
Well, you know, you're talking about Santayana's line about those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. But Hegel put it another way: what we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. You know, the real lesson learned is that it makes a big difference who's making the decision. You can put all sorts of structures into place that will try to force a correct decision or improve the likelihood of a correct decision, but it's always going to come down to the individual who makes a decision. And you know, the book on the influenza pandemic, I was looking at a lot of the same issues in terms of what happened in 1918. A lot of political decisions were made, almost all of them bad, with very few exceptions. And, you know, I was quite involved in the pandemic preparedness effort and planning. And actually, pretty much everybody involved in that effort had read that book, which is why I was invited to be part of it. And you try to put a structure into play to feed the data, but we had this minor pandemic. It was so minor, if we didn't have our, you know, modern scientific surveillance out there looking for a new influenza virus, it wouldn't even have measured on the scale. We wouldn't have noticed it. It actually killed fewer people than ordinary seasonal influenza killed. And yet even then, you know, there was a moment in time where somebody at CDC made a decision that I don't think it wouldn't have killed anybody, but it would have been very disruptive economically, to the extent when, and I was talking to people in the White House at that time, and a guy named D.A. Henderson, who, a brilliant virologist and public health person, he's the guy who eliminated smallpox from the world. That's a pretty good accomplishment. And he called me up and told me what this decision was, and I said, are they out of their effing mind? And they made the decision on a Friday. And DA, by Monday, had the White House overrule CDC. But there are two things that are relevant. Number one, people at CDC are pretty smart, but they wanted to act. It was the wrong action. This was a case where no action was the right action in this particular instance. If it hadn't been for D.A. Henderson, who everybody in the field of public health, this is a guy who eliminated smallpox from the world. You got to listen to him. If it hadn't been for DA's intervention, that recommendation would have gone forward. So, two examples of personalities. You know, nobody, you know, they take my phone call, but they're not going to take my advice over CDC. They'll listen to D.A. Henderson. So it's always going to come down to the individual who's making the decision. You can make sure they get the right data. You can try to make sure the flows are right. You try to make sure that they don't have yes men and women. But even if all that works, you know, sometimes it's character, sometimes it's intelligence, sometimes it's judgment, all of which are different things. Yes?
Who would get the call today?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear you.
Who would get the call today instead of today?
Well, every public health scientist I knew, and most of them, these are, you know, top senior staff, everybody I knew has left. They're not there now. So, I don't know. And they left like in February, March this year. They're not happy. So, last question, or, you know, I'm happy to stay here, but I don't want to. Oh, well, I got two questions. I'll take two more questions. That gentleman and then this guy over here.
I was just thinking about, in this past year, we've heard a lot about echo chambers and how people are hearing kind of what they want to hear through the information that they're receiving or choosing to be exposed to. And South Louisiana is built around kind of identifying with culture and identifying with oil and gas industry. And I was wondering if you have maybe seen both sides. I mean, I think in here there might be more of one side than another. But just oil and gas people, and they have value to their work and they have value to their industry. But are they starting to realize that there's also sort of, the effect? Are they starting to see the effect as well?
Well, when 3 years ago, or actually the lawsuit was filed in 2013, so 4 years ago, we filed the lawsuit. Practically the day we filed the lawsuit, we are informed that a very high priority for the next legislative session was going to be passing a law to either destroy the board and kill the lawsuit that way, or retroactively pass a law taking away our right to file the lawsuit. I love that one. So we go into the legislative session. There are, depending on how you count, 19 different bills filed to kill the lawsuit or to gut the, you probably don't know how good that levee board was. We had a past president of the American Society of Civil Engineers. We had the chairman of a National Academy of Sciences working group on coastal risk reduction. We had the chief engineer for California's 1,500 miles of levees. We had a guy who wrote engineering textbooks. We had practicing engineers. We had a meteorologist who pioneered storm surge modeling. This was a great board. And the idea of gutting that board and putting cronies on, anyway, it was scary. As I said, there are 19 bills, each of which took a different angle of attack to kill the lawsuit. Well, as it turns out, at the time I didn't feel like we had won. But going into that session, everybody said, you're going to get killed. The governor's making it. Some members of the legislature told me the governor told them, or they had heard, that the governor had said. I've yet to find a legislator who said the governor told me, but several told me they had heard, that the governor said his highest priority in that legislative session was killing the lawsuit. You have the most powerful lobby in the state, the oil and gas industry, obviously trying to kill it. You have Louisiana Association of Business and Industry, the second most powerful lobby, trying to kill it. We should have gotten crushed. But we killed 18 of the 19 bills. The one bill that passed, they had to pull out of one committee where we had it beat, put it in another committee, which violated the state constitution, and they had to do it so fast, a judge ruled, number one, that it was unconstitutional on 3 grounds, separate grounds, and number 2, it was so poorly written it didn't apply to the levee board. So we were in a lot better shape. And the reason we were in a lot better shape was because everybody knew we were right. The problem, and we polled before the legislative session, and this was an honest poll. We weren't releasing it to the press. We wanted to know where we were. And we polled below I-10, which I guess includes Lafayette. And the worst number we got in different parishes was 2-to-1 in favor of the lawsuit. That was the worst. That was in Lake Charles. So we were polling the oil industry areas, and it was at least 2-to-1 in favor of keeping the lawsuit going. Because they know it. They know it. The frustrating thing to me, and is why I say it's up to you and your friends, is that these polling numbers, which were real, wasn't a push poll. These polling numbers never crossed at what in the legislature, the legislators are one side of a rail, lobbyists and everybody else is on the other side of the rail. They never got inside the rail. In a way they did because, in effect, as I said, when that one bill passed, I didn't feel that we were successful when I left the legislature that day, but in retrospect, we were. So, but those people weren't, they were voting not based on the polling. They were voting because someone told a supplier to call their legislator, somebody in a related business. So the supplier called the legislator. It was a level of intensity. I mean, a lot of that happened. So they care about those phone calls. They weren't getting phone calls from constituents saying don't vote for it. Let the lawsuit keep going. So I think I had many people from the industry come up to me and say, geez, you're right. Of course, I worked to kill the bill. I said, well, what do you do that for? Actually, somebody told me this. A pretty senior executive at a company big enough that they're publicly traded, said that to me exactly. And I said, if you thought I was right. Why did you vote why did you work to kill it? And he said, well, everybody was doing it. Nobody was standing up. That comes back to character. If he had stood up and said, this is ridiculous, I'm not going to vote to kill this, I think, frankly, the industry should come across with something. Well, then maybe somebody else would have stood up. And then maybe somebody else would have. And that was exactly why we filed the lawsuit, because we had the political, the shield that we couldn't be replaced. Again, my term expired. And I thought that would allow us to take the heat and that then other people could come forward. And to some extent, that's happened, although frankly, I'm a little disappointed it hadn't been more, but the governor will do it now, I think. I'm almost certain. So I'm not sure I agree with your premise. And the fear about jobs, I don't think industry left the state because of lawsuits. They've been saying that since 1946. Texaco took some state regulations when the state actually tried to enforce things all the way to the state Supreme Court and then the U.S. Supreme Court, and they lost. They were still here. The oil's here, the pipelines are here, the gas is here. They've all the office jobs already left New Orleans, went to Houston. I'm sure there are some in Lafayette. They might take some of them, But what about that slide from the study, if you actually funded the master plan, that you create 109,000 jobs? And they weren't talking about construction jobs. They were talking about permanent jobs. There are only 58,000 oil and gas jobs. So, and this gentleman had the last question.
It seems to me that as we continue to develop lands, and I use that in quotes, develop lands that have never had anything on them historically or been populated, that we pay in this state a double cost. One of those costs is that each flood recovery will be necessarily more expensive than the last one because there will be more infrastructure to repair and maintain and so forth. And the other one is that the cost that we pay in terms of the fact that we have natural drainage areas and wetlands and things that now have concrete on top of them. It would seem to me that one of the tools in a toolbox would be at some level either local, state, parish, town, city, that some effort might be done to mitigate that or to de-incentivize perhaps those types of, and again I use the quotes, developments into those types of areas, previously unpopulated areas. Has there, to your knowledge, ever been any sort of work at that level to either de-incentivize or to reclaim areas like that?
Not a lot. I mean, there's been some. I think it's a very good point, and I'm in virtually total agreement with you. One of the early, I don't know that it was never part of the actual master plan, but one of the more expensive price tags on a study done by the Corps was on buyouts. That was the most expensive part of the plan. Not construction of diversions or levees, it was buyouts. And probably my biggest disappointment in the state's planning is in that area. There's a little bit of that, but there isn't a lot. Mississippi, Louisiana's, by far #1 in terms of planning for this kind of thing. But Mississippi has talked about buyouts pretty upfront, and we weren't. And the other thing is the kind of infrastructure that you build. New Orleans in I guess it was 95, had 19 inches of rain in 24 hours and had floods not unlike what you saw the other day, although there's a lot more rain. And they started this project, which they funded, called SELA, Southeast Louisiana drainage, I don't know why it's not CELDA, but anyway. And it's on the old model of drainage. And they're building it now. It's a couple of $2 billion. Aside from if you've been uptown New Orleans, it's totally disruptive. You know, you go down Napoleon Avenue or Jefferson, you still can't, they've been working on Jefferson Avenue for at least 2 years and maybe 3, and you still can't go down Jefferson Avenue. And it's the old model. Instead of what you hear about now, the whole living with water concept, instead of paving things, you allow the water to seep through so the land doesn't get compacted, you know, like a sponge. When it's wet, it's big. When it dries out, it shrinks. So when the land dries out, which it continues to do, you subside. If you fill it up, it's higher. That and, you know, other areas that were reserved for water to go, you know, those reservations for water, wouldn't call them a reservoir, you know, they weren't going to help you from a hurricane storm surge overtopping a levee, but they were supposed to help you in a rain event. And New Orleans has made a verbal commitment to that kind of thing, and there are certain areas of the city around Gentilly and so forth where they're sort of implementing it, but there's a lot of talk, but there hasn't been the full-throated commitment to that. You know, that and the idea that 100-year protection, oh, that's great protection, we're safe, which is ludicrous. Ludicrous. You know, that people have not raised their houses. There was a program for that. It's not much taken advantage. I don't want to close on this, but I guess I will. I don't know how many of you are mathematically inclined, but 100-year protection means a storm with a 1% chance of hitting any particular year. Well, that's like flipping a coin. You know, you think you flip the coin 20 times, it's going to come up heads 20 times in a row. Each time, the odds change. In the average person's lifetime, there's a better than 60% chance they will see at least one storm bigger than a 100-year storm. At least. Since 1927, there have been multiple floods. That's 90 years ago. There was 19 that have exceeded the 100-year standard, some of which have smashed it. The 27 flood, the 37 flood, the 73 flood, and the 2011 flood. That's 4 floods in 90 years, each of which broke the 100-year standard for a flood. And yet you think 100-year protection is going to save you? You're obviously not very well informed, or I don't want to go to the track with you. So on that, thanks again.